On a bitter February morning in 1968, Father Thomas McKenna pulled his wool coat tighter as he walked through the snow-dusted streets of Cleveland, Ohio. The industrial city stretched before him under a gray sky, factory smokestacks puncturing the horizon like silent sentinels. He had served at St. Stanislaus Church for 11 years, ministering to a working-class parish where Polish and Lithuanian immigrants mixed with Irish and Italian families, all seeking the American dream amid the cold reality of steel mills and assembly lines. Father McKenna believed that morning, as he unlocked the heavy wooden doors of his church, that he understood the boundaries of his sacred duties. He could never have imagined how profoundly the events of that day would test not only his vows, but also his understanding of loyalty, faith, and the invisible war being waged in the shadows of his own community. Little did he know that within hours he would find himself at the center of one of the most delicate moral dilemmas a priest could face during the Cold War, a situation that would force him to navigate the treacherous waters between his sacred obligations and the security of his nation. But before we dive into this story, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so we can bring you the most gripping Cold War and espionage stories every day. And tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It really helps support us. Father McKenna was 43 years old that winter, a man whose life had been shaped by service and sacrifice. Born in Boston to Irish immigrant parents, he had felt the calling to priesthood at 16, entering seminary just as the Second World War engulfed the world. His father had worked the docks, his mother cleaned houses for wealthy families in Beacon Hill, and young Thomas had grown up understanding that life demanded hard choices and harder work. The seminary had refined his faith, given structure to his devotion, and when he was ordained in 1951, he believed he had found his purpose. His assignment to Cleveland came 3 years later, to a parish that needed a priest who understood the struggles of working people, who could speak to them not from a place of judgment, but from shared experience. St. Stanislaus Church stood on East 65th Street, a magnificent structure of red brick and limestone that seemed almost defiant in its beauty amid the surrounding industrial landscape. The church had been built by Polish immigrants in 1904, its twin spires reaching toward heaven with the determination of people who had crossed an ocean to build new lives. The stained glass windows depicted saints and biblical scenes in colors that transformed ordinary sunlight into something transcendent. Inside, the smell of incense and candle wax mingled with the faint industrial odors that seeped in from outside, a reminder that this was a church for working people, a place where calloused hands folded in prayer and tired bodies knelt before God, seeking strength for another day. The parish had grown over the decades, absorbing waves of new immigrants, each group adding its own traditions and struggles to the community fabric. By the 1960s, the neighborhood was changing again. Younger families were moving to the suburbs, pursuing better schools and newer houses, while older parishioners remained, bound by memory and habit to homes they had occupied for decades. The Cold War cast a long shadow over everyone's lives. The threat of nuclear annihilation felt real and immediate. Schoolchildren practiced duck-and-cover drills. Families built fallout shelters in their basements, and the news brought daily reports of tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. In this atmosphere of fear and suspicion, communities like St. Stanislaus became havens of stability, places where ancient rituals provided comfort against an uncertain future. Father McKenna had developed a reputation as a compassionate confessor, someone who listened without judgment and offered guidance rooted in both scripture and practical wisdom. He spent hours each week in the confessional, that small wooden booth where people brought their sins, their fears, their most private struggles. The confessional at St. Stanislaus was traditional, a dark wooden structure with separate compartments for priest and penitent, a screen between them to preserve anonymity. Father McKenna had heard thousands of confessions in that space, stories of marital infidelity and workplace dishonesty, of angry words spoken in haste and opportunities for kindness left unseized. He had heard confessions from men who struggled with alcoholism, women trapped in difficult marriages, teenagers wrestling with doubts about their faith. Each confession was a sacred trust, protected by the seal of the confessional. a vow that bound him to absolute silence about anything revealed in that sacred space. The seal of confession was not merely a rule, but a fundamental principle of Catholic theology, one that Father McKenna had studied extensively in seminary. Canon law was explicit and uncompromising. A priest could not reveal anything learned in confession under any circumstances, not to save his own life, not to prevent a crime, not to aid justice. The penalty for violating the seal was automatic excommunication, a spiritual death sentence that could only be lifted by the Pope himself. Father McKenna understood that when someone knelt in the confessional, they were not speaking to Thomas McKenna the man, but to Christ through his ordained representative. The confessional was a place outside normal human relations, a sacred space where divine mercy met human frailty. To violate that space would be to betray not just an individual but the very nature of the sacrament itself. On that February morning, Father McKenna entered the church just after 7 o'clock, preparing for the 8 o'clock Mass. The interior was cold, the furnace having cycled down overnight, and his breath formed small clouds in the dim light. He moved through the sacristy with practiced efficiency, laying out the vestments and preparing the altar. The chalice gleamed in the candlelight, the wine and hosts were carefully arranged, and everything was ready when the first parishioners began to arrive. They came in small groups, mostly older women who attended daily Mass, their devotion as regular as their heartbeats. Father McKenna celebrated Mass with them, his voice echoing through the mostly empty church, the Latin prayers flowing with the ease of long practice. After Mass, he spent an hour in his office handling administrative duties, responding to letters, reviewing the parish finances, planning for an upcoming wedding. At 11 o'clock, he made his way to the confessional, as he did every Tuesday and Saturday morning, to hear confessions. The church was quiet now, just a few people scattered in the pews, heads bowed in prayer or meditation. Father McKenna settled into his side of the confessional, adjusting the purple stole around his neck, the symbol of his authority to absolve sins. He opened the small wooden panel that covered the screen and waited. The confessional smelled of old wood and generations of whispered prayers, a scent that had become as familiar to him as his own skin. The first penitents were regulars, people he recognized by voice if not by face. An elderly woman confessed to speaking harshly to her daughter. A young man admitted to missing Mass the previous Sunday without good reason. Father McKenna offered gentle counsel, assigned small penances of prayers, and pronounced absolution in the ancient formula that had been used for centuries. The morning proceeded with its usual rhythm, each confession a small drama of conscience and grace. Then, around noon, he heard the door on the other side of the screen open and close. Someone knelt in the darkness beyond the screen, but there was a long silence, longer than usual. Father McKenna waited patiently. Sometimes people needed time to gather courage, to find words for things they had held secret. Finally, a voice came through the screen, a man's voice accented in a way that Father McKenna could not quite place. The man spoke English fluently, but with pronunciation that suggested it was not his native tongue. The words came slowly at first, tentative, as if the speaker was feeling his way through unfamiliar territory. Father McKenna responded with the traditional opening, inviting the penitent to confess, assuring him of God's mercy and forgiveness. What followed over the next 20 minutes would fundamentally alter Father McKenna's understanding of his role as a priest and citizen. The man began by saying it had been many years since his last confession, more than a decade, perhaps longer. He said he had grown up Catholic in a country where religion was discouraged, where attending church could cost you opportunities or worse. He had left the church, he said, not out of loss of faith, but out of fear and ambition. He had made choices, he continued, that had taken him far from the simple faith of his childhood. His voice carried a weight of accumulated regret, and Father McKenna found himself drawn into the man's story, despite the strangeness of some details. The man spoke of living under an assumed identity, of deceiving people who trusted him, of serving purposes he no longer believed in. He spoke in generalities at first, dancing around specifics, but slowly the confession became more concrete. The man revealed that he was not who his neighbors and co-workers believed him to be. He was not an ordinary immigrant pursuing the American dream. He had been sent to Cleveland with a specific mission: to gather information, to cultivate sources, to serve as an intelligence operative for a foreign power. Father McKenna felt his breath catch in his throat as he grasped the implications of what he was hearing. The man continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, saying that he had been recruited young, trained extensively, and deployed to the United States more than 5 years earlier. He had built a life here, a credible cover identity, integrated into the community, and for years he had successfully fulfilled his mission, sending reports back through carefully established channels, never arousing suspicion. But something had changed, the man said. He had begun to question his mission, to see the people around him not as targets or assets, but as human beings whose trust he was betraying. He spoke of a particular family who had befriended him, who had invited him into their home for holidays, whose children called him uncle. He spoke of attending church functions, of participating in parish activities, of feeling something he had not expected to feel, a sense of genuine belonging, of community, of the very thing he had left behind when he accepted his assignment. The accumulated weight of his deception had become unbearable, he said, and he found himself drawn back to the church of his childhood, seeking something he could not fully articulate. Not redemption, perhaps, but at least honesty, at least one place where he could speak the truth of who he was and what he had done. Father McKenna sat in the darkness of his side of the confessional, his mind racing even as he maintained the calm, pastoral presence expected of him. He asked careful questions, seeking to understand the man's contrition, his willingness to change his life, his readiness to face consequences. The man responded that he wanted to stop, that he was tired of lying, tired of betraying people who had shown him kindness. But he also said he was afraid, that simply walking away was not an option, that the organization he served did not allow people to resign, that attempts to leave could result in threats to his family back in his home country, or worse. He was trapped, he said, between his conscience and his fear, and he had come to confession hoping for guidance, for absolution, for some path forward that might allow him to reclaim his soul without destroying his life. The confession continued as the man detailed some of his activities, never naming specific operations or individuals, but painting a picture that left Father McKenna with little doubt about the nature and seriousness of what he was hearing. The man spoke of information gathered at social events, of conversations carefully steered toward useful topics, of documents photographed and transmitted. He described the loneliness of his existence, the constant vigilance required to maintain his cover, the psychological toll of living a completely fabricated life. He spoke of nightmares where his true identity was discovered, of waking in the middle of the night, uncertain for a moment which person he actually was. He said he had begun drinking too much, using alcohol to silence the doubts that plagued him, but the alcohol only made things worse, loosening his tongue at dangerous moments, making him careless in ways that could prove fatal. Father McKenna listened to all of this with a growing sense of dread. He understood that he was hearing a confession unlike any he had encountered in his priesthood. This was not a matter of personal morality alone, but of national security, of espionage, of the very real conflict between the United States and its adversaries. The man before him, hidden behind the screen, was by definition a traitor to the country that had given Father McKenna and his family their home and opportunities. Yet the man was also a penitent, someone seeking forgiveness and guidance, someone who had trusted in the sacred seal of the confessional to unburden his soul. Father McKenna felt the full weight of his priestly vows pressing down on him. The seal of confession was absolute. Father McKenna could not reveal what he had heard to anyone, not to the police, not to the FBI, not to his bishop, not even to another priest in casual conversation. He could not use the information in any way that might identify the penitent or betray his trust. He could not even allow his knowledge to influence his behavior toward people in the parish if that might somehow reveal what he knew. The confessional was a space of complete confidentiality, and to violate it would be to commit one of the gravest sins a priest could commit, an act that would result in his immediate excommunication and the destruction of his priesthood. He had taken solemn vows, had promised before God to maintain this seal, and no earthly authority could release him from that obligation. Yet at the same time, Father McKenna was an American citizen, someone who loved his country and believed in its values. He had friends who had served in the military, parishioners who had lost loved ones in wars fighting against the very system this man served. The Cold War was not an abstraction to the people of St. Stanislaus Parish. It was real, present, dangerous. Soviet espionage in the United States was an ongoing threat, and intelligence services worked constantly to identify and neutralize foreign agents operating on American soil. If this man was telling the truth, and Father McKenna had no reason to doubt the anguished sincerity in his voice, then he possessed information that could be vital to national security. An active intelligence operative was confessing his activities to a priest who could do nothing with that information except maintain absolute silence. The moral dilemma was profound and immediate. Father McKenna knew the theological arguments supporting the seal of confession. The sacrament served a vital spiritual purpose, providing a safe space for people to confront their sins honestly and seek reconciliation with God. If priests could not be trusted to maintain absolute confidentiality, people would not make sincere confessions, and the sacrament would lose its power and purpose. The Church had defended the seal of confession for centuries, had seen priests martyred rather than violate it. The seal protected not just individual penitents, but the integrity of the sacrament itself. To break it for any reason, no matter how compelling, would be to undermine the foundation of reconciliation between humans and God. Father McKenna took a deep breath and spoke to the man through the screen. He asked about the man's contrition, whether he truly regretted his actions and was committed to changing his life. The man said yes, emphatically, that he wanted to stop, wanted to live honestly, wanted to be free of the constant deception. Father McKenna then asked if the man was willing to face the consequences of his actions, to accept that true repentance might require making things right, even at great personal cost. The man hesitated, then said he did not know that he was afraid, that he wanted redemption but was not sure he had the courage to pursue it fully. Father McKenna understood. Few people were truly ready to embrace the full implications of repentance when it meant losing everything. Father McKenna counseled the man as best he could within the constraints of the confessional. He spoke of God's infinite mercy, of the possibility of redemption even for the gravest sins, but also of the need for authentic change, for actions that demonstrated genuine repentance. He said that confession was not simply a matter of speaking words, but of committing to a different path forward. He reminded the man that forgiveness was always available, but that it required honesty, courage, and willingness to make amends where possible. He assigned a penance that included daily prayer, examination of conscience, and serious reflection on how to move toward a more authentic life. Then, with a heavy heart, Father McKenna pronounced the words of absolution, extending God's forgiveness to the man kneeling in the darkness beyond the screen. After the man left, Father McKenna sat alone in the confessional for a long time. The church was silent, except for the distant hum of traffic outside and the occasional creak of old wood settling. He felt exhausted, drained by the weight of what he had heard and the impossible position in which he now found himself. He had information that could potentially protect his country and his community, but he was absolutely forbidden from using it in any way. He could not go to the authorities. He could not warn anyone. He could not even investigate on his own to learn more. The seal of confession was not a suggestion or a guideline, but an absolute prohibition. He had to act as if he knew nothing, even though his knowledge weighed on him like a physical burden. Over the following days and weeks, Father McKenna struggled with his conscience. He prayed intensely, seeking guidance from God, clarity about his obligations and responsibilities. He studied canon law and theology, reviewing everything the Church taught about the seal of confession, looking for any exception, any loophole, any way he might be able to act on what he knew without violating his sacred vows. He found none. The teaching was clear, consistent, and unambiguous across centuries of church doctrine. The seal of confession was inviolable under all circumstances. Saints and martyrs had chosen death rather than break it. Priests had gone to prison, had been tortured, had faced execution, all while maintaining their sacred obligation to silence. Father McKenna knew the history. He had studied the case of Saint John of Nepomuk, a 14th-century priest in Prague, who was martyred for refusing to reveal what the Queen had told him in confession. The king had demanded to know, had threatened and tortured the priest, and finally had him thrown from a bridge into the river where he drowned, all because he refused to violate the seal of confession. Father McKenna thought of Father Fernando Olmedo Reguera, a Spanish priest executed during the Spanish Civil War for refusing to reveal confessions. He thought of countless other priests throughout history who had chosen martyrdom over betrayal of the confessional seal. The seal was not designed to protect criminals or enemies of the state. It existed because the Church understood that people needed a place where they could be completely honest about their failings and receive guidance without fear of earthly consequences. The confessional was meant to be a space outside normal social relations, a sacred zone where divine mercy could meet human weakness unmediated by legal or political considerations. If the seal could be broken for reasons of state, then it could be broken for any reason that seemed important enough to someone in authority, and soon the sacrament would become meaningless, just another form of social control rather than a path to spiritual healing. Father McKenna understood all of this intellectually, but understanding did not ease his conscience. He lay awake at night thinking about the man who had confessed to him, wondering if the operative was still active, still gathering intelligence, still betraying his country. He thought about the people who might be harmed by whatever information the man was collecting, about classified secrets that might be compromised, about national security implications he could only imagine. He felt torn between his loyalty to his sacred vows and his loyalty to his country, and he found no easy resolution to the conflict. He could not discuss the confession with anyone. He could not seek advice from his bishop or from other priests, because even acknowledging that such a confession had occurred would be a violation of the seal. He was completely alone with his knowledge and his anguish. He thought about the possibility that the confession itself might have been a test, that Soviet intelligence might somehow know that their operative had confessed and might be watching Father McKenna to see if he would violate his vows. He thought about the possibility that the man had been lying, that the entire confession was fabricated, though he could not imagine what purpose that would serve. He thought about whether he should discourage the man from returning to confession, but that too felt like a betrayal of his priestly duty. The man did return about 2 months later, on a rainy April afternoon. Father McKenna recognized his voice immediately when he entered the confessional. The man said he had been struggling, that he had tried to live differently but found it nearly impossible. He was still sending reports, still maintaining his cover, still caught in the same trap. But he said he had stopped drinking as much, had started attending Mass regularly, had found some small measure of peace in returning to the church. He asked Father McKenna if it was possible to be both a sinner and a believer, to do wrong while seeking to do right. Father McKenna assured him that this was the human condition, that all people struggled with the gap between their ideals and their actions, that faith was not about perfection but about continual striving toward grace. They talked for a long time that afternoon, though Father McKenna was always careful to maintain the proper boundaries of the confessional. He could not give the man advice about his specific situation as an intelligence operative. He could not tell him to turn himself in or to stop his activities. Such specific guidance about matters outside the spiritual realm would be inappropriate in confession and might also constitute using information from the confessional in ways that violated the seal. But he could speak in general terms about morality, about the importance of truth, about the spiritual consequences of living dishonestly, about the courage required for genuine repentance. He could encourage the man to pray, to reflect, to seek the strength to change his life. He could remind him that God's mercy was always available, but that accepting it required genuine contrition and commitment to amendment of life. This pattern continued over the following months. The man would come to confession every few weeks, sometimes more frequently, always struggling with the same dilemma. He wanted to stop his intelligence work, but felt unable to do so without putting himself and possibly others at risk. He spoke of family members back in Eastern Europe who might face consequences if he defected or simply disappeared. He described the psychological techniques that had been used in his training, the ways he had been conditioned to view the West as an enemy, the ideological framework that had initially made his mission seem noble rather than treacherous. Now that framework had collapsed, he said, and he could see his work for what it was, but he still felt trapped by circumstances beyond his control. Father McKenna watched the man's spiritual journey with a mixture of compassion and frustration. He could see genuine change occurring, a real awakening of conscience, but it seemed to produce only anguish rather than action. The man was caught between his past and his desired future, unable to move decisively in either direction. Father McKenna wanted to help more directly, wanted to connect the man with people who could facilitate his defection, who could offer protection and new identity in exchange for cooperation. But all of that was absolutely forbidden. The seal of confession meant that Father McKenna had to act as if he knew nothing beyond what any priest might observe about a parishioner attending Mass regularly. The situation became even more complex when the man began attending other parish activities. Father McKenna would see him at coffee hours after Mass, at parish council meetings, at a fundraising dinner. The man had become, to all external appearances, an ordinary member of the parish community. People knew him, greeted him, included him in conversations. Father McKenna found these encounters excruciating. He had to interact with the man as he would with any parishioner, friendly but not too familiar, pastoral but professional. He could not allow his knowledge from the confessional to influence his behavior in any visible way. He could not warn others about the man's true identity. He had to maintain a careful neutrality that felt increasingly like complicity. One evening in September, Father McKenna was invited to dinner at the home of Michael and Susan Kowalski, longtime parishioners and pillars of the church community. Michael worked as a foreman at a steel mill. Susan taught second grade at the parish school, and they had 3 children who had all been altar servers. It was a pleasant evening, the kind of simple gathering that Father McKenna usually enjoyed, a chance to be part of his parishioners' lives outside the formal structure of church services. But his heart sank when he arrived and discovered that the man from confession was also there, invited as a friend of the family. The man was introduced as Victor Novak, a quality inspector at a manufacturing plant, originally from somewhere in Eastern Europe, though no one seemed quite sure exactly where. He had, Father McKenna learned, helped Michael with some technical problem at the mill, and a friendship had developed. Victor was charming, thoughtful, quick to laugh at jokes and share stories. He spoke with genuine warmth about Michael and Susan's kindness to him, about how they had made him feel welcome in a country that could sometimes feel foreign and overwhelming. He played with the children, helping them with a puzzle, telling them stories from his childhood. He fit perfectly into the domestic scene, and watching him, Father McKenna felt a complex mixture of emotions. He could see that Victor, if that was even his real name, was not simply playing a role. The affection seemed genuine, the gratitude sincere. This was not a cold-blooded operative cynically manipulating innocence, but a human being caught between competing identities and loyalties. Yet that did not change the fundamental reality that Victor was betraying everyone in that room, including Father McKenna himself. Every friendship was a deception, every confidence potentially a security risk, every kindness exploited for purposes these good people could not imagine. Father McKenna struggled through the evening, making conversation, accepting Susan's excellent cooking, all while maintaining the careful neutrality that his vows demanded. After dinner, Michael mentioned that a friend of his, someone who worked in a defense contractor's offices, had been asking about quality control procedures at the mill. He wondered aloud if Victor might be interested in meeting him, as they could probably have interesting technical discussions. Father McKenna saw Victor's face remain carefully neutral, saw the brief flicker of interest quickly suppressed, and understood with sudden clarity how intelligence gathering worked in practice. It was not usually dramatic or obvious, but consisted of casual conversations, innocent-seeming questions, gradual cultivation of relationships that might eventually provide access to useful information. The dinner party itself was probably an intelligence opportunity, a chance to assess Michael's connections and potential usefulness. Father McKenna wanted desperately to intervene, to warn Michael, to prevent what might be the beginning of Victor's recruitment of a new source. But he could do nothing. To warn Michael would require explaining how he knew about Victor's true identity, and that would violate the seal of confession. Even a vague warning without specifics might constitute a breach of the seal if it allowed someone to deduce what Father McKenna had learned in the confessional. He was trapped by his vows, forced to sit silently while potentially watching his parishioners being targeted for exploitation. The moral weight of that silence was crushing. The evening ended with warm goodbyes all around. Victor shook Father McKenna's hand, thanked him for his pastoral care, though without any specific reference to their confessional encounters, and left with Michael, who offered to drive him home since they lived near each other. Father McKenna helped Susan clear dishes, accepted her offer of leftover pie to take back to the rectory, and walked home through the cool September night, feeling more conflicted and alone than at any time in his priesthood. He had dedicated his life to serving God and helping people, yet his most sacred duty prevented him from protecting his own parishioners from danger he knew was real and immediate. Over the following weeks, Father McKenna prayed intensely for guidance. He reread the gospel passages about truth and deception, about rendering unto Caesar what was Caesar's, and unto God what was God's. He studied the Church Fathers' writings on moral dilemmas, where different goods seemed to conflict. He reflected on the nature of conscience and obedience, on when rules served higher purposes, and when they might paradoxically undermine those purposes. But always he returned to the same conclusion. The seal of confession was not his to break, regardless of circumstances. It belonged to God and to the Church, and neither his personal judgment about consequences nor his sincere desire to protect people could justify violating it. He thought about the larger context of the Cold War and the Church's position within it. The Catholic Church had been consistently anti-communist, viewing Soviet ideology as fundamentally incompatible with religious faith. Pope Pius XII had spoken forcefully against communism, and many American Catholics saw their faith and their patriotism as aligned in opposition to Soviet expansionism. Yet the Church also maintained diplomatic channels with communist countries, had priests and bishops working behind the Iron Curtain under difficult and dangerous conditions, and understood that the gospel transcended political divisions. The Church's mission was to save souls, not to serve as an arm of Western intelligence services, even when its ministers possessed information that might be useful to those services. Father McKenna also reflected on the nature of Victor's confession and transformation. Despite his continued intelligence activities, the man seemed genuinely changed in important ways. He attended Mass regularly, received communion, participated in parish life with what appeared to be authentic faith. He had stopped drinking heavily, had become more thoughtful and introspective, had spoken in confession about finding meaning in community and worship that had been absent from his life for years. Was it possible, Father McKenna wondered, that the sacrament was working exactly as it was supposed to work, bringing a lost soul back toward God, even while that soul remained entangled in circumstances that resisted easy resolution? Was the spiritual healing occurring in Victor's life more important than the security concerns his activities raised? Father McKenna knew that some might argue he was rationalizing inaction, finding theological justifications for failure to act. But he also knew that the Church's position on the seal of confession was not based on situational ethics or consequentialist reasoning. It was based on the understanding that some principles were absolute, that the sanctity of the confessional could not be made contingent on cost-benefit analyses of individual cases. To start making exceptions, even for compelling reasons, would be to begin down a path that ended with the complete destruction of the sacrament's integrity. In November, Victor came to confession again, and this time his demeanor was different. He seemed more agitated, his voice strained with barely controlled emotion. He confessed that he had been ordered to cultivate a specific individual, someone with access to classified defense information, someone he had already met through his friendship with the Kowalski family. He was supposed to gradually develop the relationship, to assess the person's vulnerabilities, to begin the slow process of recruitment that might eventually lead to the person becoming a conscious or unconscious source of intelligence. But Victor said he could not do it. He said that looking at this person, seeing him as a target rather than as a human being, had crystallized everything he had been struggling with over the past months. He told Father McKenna that he had decided to defect. He did not know exactly how, did not know whom to trust or how to navigate the process, but he knew he could not continue as he had been. He asked Father McKenna if it was a sin to betray one's country. Father McKenna chose his words very carefully, speaking in general terms about loyalty and conscience, about the difference between one's government and one's conscience, about the supreme obligation to follow the truth, as one understood it, even when that created conflicts with other obligations. He could not tell Victor to defect, could not offer specific advice about how to do so, but he could affirm that following one's conscience in good faith was never sinful, even when it led to difficult choices. Victor asked if Father McKenna thought God could forgive someone who had betrayed trust, who had lied and deceived for years. Father McKenna assured him that God's mercy was infinite, that no sin was beyond forgiveness for someone who truly repented. He reminded Victor that Peter had denied Christ 3 times, that Paul had persecuted Christians before his conversion, that the church was full of redeemed sinners who had found their way back to grace after profound failures. What mattered was not the past, but the willingness to change, the courage to face consequences, the determination to live differently going forward. Victor wept quietly on the other side of the screen, and Father McKenna felt his own eyes fill with tears at the sound of such anguish and hope mingled together. After that confession, Father McKenna did not see Victor for several weeks. He continued to attend to his regular duties, celebrating Mass, visiting the sick, counseling parishioners, overseeing the parish school. But part of his mind was always wondering about Victor, worrying about what might be happening, hoping that the man had found a way forward that would honor both his spiritual awakening and his complex practical situation. Father McKenna prayed for Victor daily, careful prayers that did not reveal specific details, even in the privacy of his own devotions, but fervent nonetheless. In early December, 2 men in dark suits visited Father McKenna at the rectory. They identified themselves as agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and they wanted to ask him some questions about a parishioner named Victor Novak. Father McKenna felt his heart rate accelerate, but maintained his composure. He invited the agents into his office, a modest room lined with books of theology and canon law, and listened to their questions. They wanted to know when he had first met Victor, how often he saw him, what they talked about, whether Victor had ever said anything unusual or suspicious. They were professional and polite, but clearly on an important investigation. Father McKenna answered their questions as honestly as he could, while respecting the boundaries of privileged information. He confirmed that Victor attended his parish, that he had seen him at various church functions, that he seemed to be a sincere, if somewhat reserved, participant in parish life. But he could say nothing about the confessions, nothing that would reveal what he knew about Victor's true identity and activities. When the agents asked if Victor had ever talked to him about his past or his work, Father McKenna said that many parishioners shared aspects of their lives with him, but that some conversations were protected by religious privilege, and he could not discuss them. The agents seemed to understand, though they pressed a bit, asking if Father McKenna understood the seriousness of espionage investigations, if he realized that national security might be at stake. Father McKenna assured them that he took such matters very seriously, but that his religious obligations were not negotiable. He could not and would not discuss anything protected by the seal of confession, regardless of consequences. The agents exchanged glances, clearly frustrated but also aware that they could not compel a priest to violate his sacred vows. One of them asked, hypothetically, if Father McKenna would report information about espionage if he learned about it outside of a confessional context. Father McKenna said that would depend on the circumstances, but that generally, yes, he believed citizens had obligations to their country, and he would not obstruct legitimate law enforcement activities. But the seal of confession, he emphasized, created a different situation entirely, one where his religious duties took absolute precedence over civic obligations. The agents left, giving Father McKenna their cards and asking him to contact them if he remembered anything helpful or if Victor said anything that might be relevant to their investigation. After they departed, Father McKenna sat alone in his office for a long time, staring at the business cards, wondering what had led the FBI to Victor, whether Victor himself had initiated contact with authorities or whether their investigation had uncovered him through other means. He wondered if his refusal to cooperate would mark him as somehow suspicious or unpatriotic. He worried about how the situation would resolve and what consequences might follow. 2 days later, the local newspaper carried a front-page story about the arrest of a Soviet intelligence operative who had been living in Cleveland under false identity for more than 5 years. The article did not name the individual, but said he had been taken into custody after voluntarily contacting federal authorities and offering to provide information about Soviet espionage networks in exchange for protection and asylum. The article mentioned that the operative had become disillusioned with his mission and had decided to defect, providing details about his training, his handlers, and his activities that were proving valuable to counterintelligence efforts. Federal officials were quoted praising the defector's cooperation and emphasizing that his information would help protect national security. Father McKenna read the article with a profound sense of relief and vindication. Victor had found his own way forward, had made his own choice to act on his conscience, had resolved his moral dilemma through his own courage rather than through Father McKenna's intervention. The priest had maintained the seal of confession, had not violated his sacred vows, and yet the outcome had still served justice and security. God, it seemed, had worked through the sacrament exactly as the Church taught it should work, bringing a sinner to repentance and giving him the strength to change his life fundamentally. The confessional had been a place of transformation, not obstruction, of healing rather than enabling continued wrongdoing. A few weeks later, Father McKenna received a letter, forwarded through the FBI and carefully screened for security purposes. It was from Victor, though he was using a different name now, beginning his new life with a new identity in an undisclosed location. The letter was brief and carefully worded to avoid revealing protected information, but its message was clear and heartfelt. Victor thanked Father McKenna for his pastoral care, for providing a sacred space where truth could be spoken, for offering guidance without judgment, for maintaining the confidentiality that had allowed Victor to work through his conscience without fear. He said that the confessional had been the only place where he could be completely honest, where the competing demands of his multiple identities could be temporarily set aside, where he could simply be a human soul seeking God's mercy. That honesty, he wrote, had ultimately given him the courage to make the difficult choice that had led to his defection. The letter concluded with Victor saying that he was attending a different church now, in a different city, under a different name, but that he thought often of St. Stanislaus and Father McKenna. He said he was grateful that the church understood the need for absolute confidentiality in the confessional, that without that protection, he would never have sought spiritual counsel, would never have begun the process of examination and change that had ultimately transformed his life. He asked Father McKenna to pray for him as he continued to cooperate with authorities and build a new life based on truth rather than deception. The letter ended with a simple blessing and no return address. Father McKenna kept the letter in his desk drawer, reading it occasionally when he needed reassurance about the difficult path he had walked during those months. He never spoke publicly about Victor's case, never confirmed or denied the speculation that inevitably arose in the parish about whether Viktor Novak might have been the Soviet operative mentioned in news reports. He maintained the seal of confession absolutely, taking his knowledge to God alone in prayer, but sharing it with no human authority. The FBI agents never returned, apparently satisfied with whatever information Victor had provided during his debriefing. Years later, long after Father McKenna had retired from active ministry, he would reflect on that difficult period as one of the defining challenges of his priesthood. It had tested his commitment to his vows in ways he had never anticipated when he was ordained. It had forced him to hold in tension competing goods, loyalty to country and loyalty to sacred obligations, desire to protect his community, and commitment to the sacrament's integrity. He had emerged from that test with his vows intact and with deeper appreciation for why the Church insisted so absolutely on the inviolability of the confessional seal. The seal protected not just individual privacy, but the very possibility of genuine transformation. It created a space where people could face their worst selves honestly, knowing that human judgment was suspended and divine mercy was available without condition. The Cold War continued for many years after Victor's defection, with countless other intelligence operatives working in shadows, gathering secrets, serving their governments in the twilight world of espionage. Some were caught, some defected, some served undetected for entire careers. Father McKenna never knew if he encountered any others in his confessional, never had his vows tested again in quite the same way. But he remained vigilant about protecting the seal, educating younger priests about its importance, and resisting any suggestion that exceptions might be made for compelling reasons. He understood, as perhaps only someone who had lived through such a dilemma could understand, that the seal had to be absolute, precisely because the reasons to break it could seem so compelling. Once you started weighing costs and benefits, once you began calculating whether this particular confession was important enough to warrant breach of confidence, the whole edifice would crumble. The Church's position on the seal of confession came under increasing pressure in subsequent decades. Laws were passed requiring clergy to report child abuse, creating new tensions between religious privilege and public safety. Some argued that priests should not be allowed to protect criminals through confidentiality. Others maintained that destroying the seal would not actually increase reporting of crimes, but would simply drive people away from confession, losing the opportunity for intervention and transformation that the sacrament provided. Father McKenna watched these debates from his retirement, grateful that he had served in an era when the principle was still widely understood and respected, even by secular authorities. He thought often about Victor, wondering what had become of him, whether he had successfully rebuilt his life, whether he had maintained his renewed faith, or had fallen away once the crisis that drove him to the confessional had passed. Father McKenna prayed for him regularly, adding him to the long list of souls he commended to God's mercy. He hoped Victor had found peace, had managed to live with his past while building something better for his future. He imagined Victor somewhere, perhaps raising a family, working an ordinary job, attending Sunday Mass at a parish where no one knew his history. That seemed to Father McKenna a fitting outcome. A life redeemed through grace, a transformation made possible by the sacred space of confession where truth could be spoken without fear of earthly consequences. The experience had also deepened Father McKenna's appreciation for the complexities of moral life. He had entered priesthood with somewhat simplistic notions of right and wrong, of virtue and sin. His years in the confessional had taught him that real life was messier, that people were caught in circumstances not entirely of their own making, that doing right often required navigating between competing obligations rather than following clear rules. He had learned that mercy required understanding context without using context to excuse wrongdoing, that forgiveness had to be both freely given and genuinely costly to be meaningful. He had learned that his role as a priest was not to judge, but to facilitate encounter between sinners and a God of infinite compassion. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. Do not forget to subscribe for more incredible stories, and check out the video on screen. I am sure you will enjoy it. See you next time.